Maybe you've been studying a language for months, years, even sometimes tens of years. Yet when it comes time to speaking, your brain freezes. Or maybe you feel like you're stuck at an intermediate level and can't progress no matter what you do, and you do not know why you're not progressing, even though you're trying to learn as much as possible. If this sounds like you, you're not alone. I've taught so many students, and I see a couple of mistakes that they make and some glass ceilings that they hit, which is why they can't progress and feel like they're stuck at a certain level. Of course, learning a language takes time. But regardless, if you feel like you're not progressing, keep watching this video. Maybe you're making some of these mistakes that I'm gonna talk about and how I help my students get through these hurdles. So the first one can be you're learning, but you're not actually using the language. Input and output are equally important. So maybe consider the possibility that you're inputting too much and you're not trying to output. Now, that can look like watching a lot of YouTube videos, series, other things, but not trying to imitate what they're saying or the way that they're speaking. Or it could be just reading books without really summarizing them in your head or writing something out afterwards. Maybe you also listen to podcasts, but you don't really necessarily put in the effort to use the words and the new phrases that you learned throughout these podcasts. Now, this is all really good if you're trying to nail down the skills for reading and listening. However, comprehension and actually outputting a language are two massively different skills. So this is where it is really important for you to practice. However, a lot of people say just start speaking, don't think about the grammar, don't think about anything else, just try outputting something. However, I really disagree with this approach. The reason being is that so many people start speaking in native context when they're only at A2, B1 level, or even just starting out. The reason why this is problematic is later on, a lot of those mistakes that you kind of somehow learned that will be really difficult to erase. There's a very big gap in between my students who learned it in a structured manner, in a controlled environment, where they actually had the output environment that is appropriate to their level and not too high. Because the students who actually learned, and I call this in Hungarian, it's also called with hands and feet, meaning you just try to express yourself in whatever manner you can. Those students are the ones that get stuck at B2 level and cannot for the life of them progress onto C1 without putting in a lot of effort. And the reason why is simply because they learned so many mistakes, they made so many mistakes before, and they just did not know how to correct them. So they just kept repeating those same mistakes. Maybe they corrected half of them, the other half still stuck, and then they just carry that on, and it takes a really long time for them at that level to correct the mistakes. But having said that, there are some strategies that you can use to really practice the output of the language. For example, when you're listening to a YouTube video, podcast, or series, what you can also do is try shadowing. So shadowing is a technique where you listen to native speakers and try to imitate the same thing that they said with the same intonation, same pronunciation. After a while, because of all this shadowing, it will feel much more natural for you to take on the intonation of the language, which is one of the most important things when trying to sound natural. The second one is really practicing writing. Making it a habit to write even just 3 or 5 sentences each day can really help you progress in the language. Because writing ultimately is a slower version of speaking. You're just trying to form your thoughts. And if you can do that in a grammatically correct way, then speaking is going to be much better afterwards as well. So once you progress in writing, especially on the lower levels, I feel like speaking naturally comes with it. Of course, the pronunciation, the intonation, all of that is still going to be difficult. You still have to learn that. But with shadowing, I feel like all of my students so far have got really good results just by writing a lot and also shadowing. And then later on, once they're at B2, progressing onto more difficult conversations. Once you want to actually refine your language at C1, C2 level, that is where it's really important to output the language a lot, speak a lot, because then you already have the grammar, the vocabulary in place, and you just want to make it more fluent and more natural. So then it is really important to output as much as possible, regardless of the context. Similarly to this mistake number 2 that I see a lot of students making is getting stuck in passive learning mode. So there's a massive difference between passive and active learning. So passive learning can be things like going over the notes, reading through grammar rules, just looking at videos explaining the rules, and so on. Active one, on the other hand, can be things like flashcards, where you actively have to use your brain to come up with the answers to certain questions. So here, what I usually advise my students, instead of rereading notes, try writing a couple of sentences instead. Or instead of just looking through vocabulary lists, build something in Anki or just use other flashcard apps to really learn the vocabulary. Even better if that vocabulary can be integrated into what you're saying, what you're writing every single day, because that will massively help with retention. Similarly, instead of rewatching a YouTube video or rewatching some grammar clip off of YouTube or whatever is in your book, try summarizing what you learned instead. This all will help you output the language a bit easier, but also it's not just about outputting, it's about active learning instead of passive learning. I'm sure that there are a lot of videos on YouTube explaining the differences between passive and active learning, but in short, it's really just about the fact that you're not just taking in the information, but you're trying to output the answers to certain questions as well. Now, lastly, the third mistake is the one that's the most difficult to accept. Yet, again, as I said, a lot of students fall into that and it's really difficult to correct. And that is having gaps in your knowledge and therefore hitting a glass ceiling. Learning a language is like building a house. You have to have a good basis, a good structure, and then you can build more and more floors on top. However, if the bottom floors are wobbly, after a while you can't build further or it will collapse. This is the same situation where a lot of students go through the initial stages very, very quickly. More often than not, it's because they were thrown into a native environment and trying to get themselves understood, trying to also understand the people around them. This is where I experienced a lot of students having a lot of issues, because then they jump through a lot of the normal grammar rules and the normal vocabulary learning that they were supposed to do at a certain speed on the lower levels. And then when they get to around B2, they get really stuck because they think they should be progressing, especially because they're in a native environment, but they're simply not. As I already touched on in the first section, a lot of students here have to spend dedicated time to go through a lot of the grammar, a lot of the vocabulary, collocations, why things are the way things are, to be able to break through that glass ceiling. So here it is really important that you go back and check those grammar rules. It is even better if you can get a teacher to give you some feedback about what grammar rules and what areas you still have gaps in. If you don't fill in those gaps, it's going to be really difficult to progress onto the next level. What you can also do without access to a teacher is to go through all of the grammar rules in a certain summary book, for example. Pick a summary book of all the grammar rules and try to integrate each of those in 1 week of your life. So for example, 1 week you might pick the future tense and you try to use that as much as possible. You go through a lot of grammar drills and really pay attention to that when you're speaking in that native environment. So this again is something that is a bit difficult for a lot of students to accept. However, once they accept it, that is when they can really start progressing and filling in those gaps to start strengthening the basis and then being able to build up further. So having said all of that, I really think that language learning is nothing too difficult on its own, but it's definitely challenging if you don't know the right steps. So if you're interested in language learning, I'm also currently learning my 5th language in German right now, and I also have been teaching English for over 3 years. This is why I will be sharing more tips and tricks on language learning and also my journey on this channel. And if you're interested, don't forget to subscribe, like, hit the notification bell, and let me know in the comments below what are the biggest challenges for you in language learning. Have you ever encountered these gaps, or are you standing at a glass ceiling just right now? Let me know and happy learning. I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye!